delighted to start off this evening with a full house for Ross King, who is with us. It's a great pleasure to welcome Ross to the Institute. You haven't spoken here for a number of years, or never. First time. It's a debut. Fantastic. Ross needs a little introduction. He's a Canadian by birth, Oxonian by adoption. He's been living in Oxford for about 30 years. Nice and convenient for coming down to Florence and to Rome as he researches his extremely well-known books, ranging from Michelangelo's and the Pope's ceiling, Lesch's dome, Leonardo's Last Supper, and so it goes on. And tonight he's going to be talking about his latest one, The Bookseller of Florence, which I personally had loved when I read it over the summer. And as always, we'll do a Q&A at the end. And then there's books for sale at the end for those in the room. Sorry, Zoomers, you can send in mail orders if you like. And Ross has kindly agreed to sign books if you buy them at the end. I want to just finish by thanking very much Sylvia Cox, who's with us tonight, who is our sponsor for tonight's lecture. So without more, from me, I'll hand over to Ross. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Am I switched on? You can hear me okay? Good, good. Thank you, Simon, for the invitation to speak. Thank you for turning out. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk to you about the Bookseller of Florence, whose name some of you might be familiar with. I've got a subtle product placement, the cover of the book up. As Simon said, copies are on sale, temptingly offered on the front table here. But what I want to do is introduce Vespasiano to you and talk and contextualize him, look at him in the context of 15th century Florence, the golden age of Florence, whose decades from really the 1430s until the 1480s and 90s he spanned. Because this is a period that I have dealt with, but I've dealt primarily with the art. And so I wanted to look at the intellectual life that went on in Florence at that particular time. But I want to start, first of all, with this image of Florence, which is maybe a bit gratuitous and superfluous to show to you here tonight. But whenever I talk about Florence in the UK, I always bring up this is my first image. And especially on wet winter evenings, it brings out sighs of longing in the audience. But we've just flown over, we've just passed over Vespasiano's bookshop in this image. And so it's he was in the heart of Florence, both geographically, but also in the heart of Florence intellectually and culturally, because of the importance he had, not just in Florence, but really it was sort of the core of the intellectual nexus, if that's not mixing metaphors, of Florence and of Europe over the course of the middle decades of the 1400s. Now, what brings, I've been in Florence for the past couple of days, and I gather crowds, busy as they are, have thinned somewhat compared to what they were like over the course of the summer. And I suspect what brings most people to Florence is the art and the sort of artistic renaissance for which Florence is justifiably very famous. And I apologize for my line break there. I was using a very exotic Renaissance style font, which is not translated from Keynote into PowerPoint. We may see a few more examples of that. So I apologize for that sort of typographical ugliness, which is ironic considering much of this lecture is going to be about typography and script and things like that. So anyway, please forgive me for that. In any case, this is these are the people. This is the Florence that I think most tourists have come to see. Filippo Brunelleschi with the dome of the cathedral, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Botticelli, Michelangelo's David, and so forth. And let's face it, I've written about a number of these characters and tried to celebrate them. But I've always been aware that there is a different Florence that coexists with it and runs in some ways on a parallel path, but also an intersecting path with the artistic movement that went on in Florence, and in some ways preceded it. And that's a kind of intellectual one. And so I wanted to look at the way in which these two things intertwine. But just to give a very brief description of the artistic Florence, that occurred, that took place in the 1400s, We have Giorgio Vasari, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, who is kind of the exponent or the apostle of these Florentine artists. He writes that architect revealed its excellence in Florence in the 1400s. The statues began to seem almost alive. The paintings are so beautifully true to life that men portrayed appear before us just as they were seen by the painter himself. And so we have this artistic excellence being born here. But we also have a kind of intellectual excellence. And I would argue that if you grab by the lapels someone in Paris or Buda or Vienna or somewhere like that over the course, let's say the middle of the 1400s, and ask what Florence meant, they would first of all probably speak of the lovers of wisdom, the writers, the philosophers, and even if we go forward a couple of decades, the poets. And so there is this intellectual renaissance, and yes, there we are again transgressing over the image of the picture. But Florence became known by the Florentines themselves as Athens on the Arno. And because what was being reborn in Florence wasn't just ancient Rome and the art and architecture of ancient Rome, but also the Greek philosophy, because Plato was rediscovered really by the Florentines. They were the ones who in 1397 brought a guy from Constantinople named Manuel Chrysoloras into Florence to teach Greek at the university. And virtually everyone who speaks Greek, writes Greek, is a Greek scholar in Europe, and especially in Italy, over the next, let's say, 5 or 6 decades, goes back to that moment. They were either a student of Chrysoloras or a student of Chrysoloras. But there is also a kind of scientific renaissance in natural history happening at the same time. And there's this wonderful quote from a poet named Ugolino Verino from 1464, which is an interesting date. He was a friend of Leonardo da Vinci and wrote a couple of poems about him. And 1464 is around the time that Leonardo came from Vinci into Florence. He would have been 12 years old at that time. And by the mid-1460s, he had arrived here and precipitated himself into this culture that Verino describes so evocatively when he says, today there are an immense number of erudite men in the city. Some know the laws of nature. Some know the stars, because we have people studying astronomy and astrology in Florence. Some know the size of the ocean. Many even, that of course will go into this, someone like Paolo Toscanelli, the great geographer and astronomer who in many ways inspires Christopher Columbus. Many even strive to comprehend the nature of God. So Florence is where all the big intellectual guns are firing by the 1460s. And so one of the things one of the questions I often get asked if I give a talk about Florence is, what was the reason for this Florentine exceptionalism? Why was it that the Florentines seemed to reinvent culture? Or how did they have this kind of creative innovation and this remodeling of ancient Greek and Roman writing and art? And I think one of the key factors of one of the most interesting statistics you can read about Florence in the 1400s is the literacy rate, because it's been estimated, and this is a figure that I have to admit has been debated, much debated, but the best guesses are that adult male literacy in Florence in the vernacular, so in the lingua fiorentina, was 70%. And actually, female literacy was not that far behind, because Florence had a lot of nuns. In fact, the per capita of nuns in Florence was actually quite a lot higher than a lot of other cities in Italy. Now I realize 70% literacy might not mean that much unless I give you statistics about other cities. In second place, a very distant second, was Paris at about 25%. Larger city, but of course it had a great university, which Florence did not. And most cities in Germany had about 10 to 15% literacy. And once you went into the countryside, whether it was in Italy, Germany, France, England, literacy falls off a cliff. It is at about 1%. So Florence is a kind of bubble of literacy within Europe at this time. And the literacy is not just in the vernacular, it's also in Greek, Latin, and increasingly over the course of especially the last decades of the 1400s, increasingly in Hebrew, because you get the greatest Hebrew scholars outside of the Jewish world, Christians who become Hebrew scholars, people like Giannozzo Manetti, who makes one of the first translations of the Bible after St. Jerome, really the next translation of the Bible into Latin after St. Jerome. And so Giovanni Rucellai, a name with which I'm sure many of you can conjure, the great merchant and art patron in 1457, extolling Florence and giving reasons for its success, says there are more outstanding scholars of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew in Florence than ever before. But I think he could say more than elsewhere, more than anywhere else in Europe. Our men of letters have revived the elegance of the ancient style that has long been lost and forgotten. And that was, of course, one of the ambitions of the Florentine humanists, the Florentine scholars. They wanted to get back to an uncorrupted Latin, the Latin of Cicero and Julius Caesar, the Latin written during the golden age of the last years of the Republic and the years of Augustus, the first decades of the empire. And so Florence is this city of readers where there is a consumption of books, books and manuscripts. And one of the manifestations of this interest in literature and the literacy that exists here is the fact that Florence had the first public library since antiquity, since ancient Rome. The ancient Romans had about 20 public libraries. And when the Florentine humanists began reading about how Marcus Aurelius would go and borrow books from libraries and temples, and Aulus Gellius in Attic Nights would describe all of the libraries in ancient Rome, their mouths were watering, and they decided that we have to have something like that as a public good for this, not only the scholars in Florence, but also the scholars from elsewhere. And so you might know that the Library of San Marco was open thanks to the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici in 1444. The San Marco, of course, was an institution that he really endowed when he gave it to the Dominicans and had Michelozzo do the construction for it. And there was a kind of board of trustees for this museum, at the head of which, of course, was Cosimo himself. But Poggio Bracciolini, the great manuscript hunter, when extolling really trying to sell the idea of the public library, said what could be more splendid, more pleasing, more useful to the community than if a public library could be made. And so they see books and knowledge as a way of furthering not just the commercial interests of the city, and that was a big part of it, but also the sort of betterment of humankind, of making the world a better place, something I'll come to in a couple of minutes. Florence also had the second library, which many of you have probably walked past. This is the House of Wisdom, that was the library of the cathedral. And it was originally open, or it was its core collection was liturgical books from the cathedral, but by the late 1440s and early 1450s, it became a kind of humanistic library as well, as they began acquiring works of classical antiquity, works like Cicero and so forth. And Vespasiano da Bisticci, of course, becomes involved in the acquisition of volumes to populate this library. And once again, there's the idea of it being a public good, where statutes say that it's facilitating and accommodating whomever wishes to study. And so there is a kind at the fingertips of literate, especially literate in Latin and possibly Greek, Florentines or scholars from elsewhere, all of this knowledge, which is suddenly becoming available in the middle part of the 1400s and leading to a kind of critical mass. So the last point I'll just make along this, point that I'm belaboring is that it was more than art and architecture, which is being salvaged and revived, because of course, what you get in descriptions of the Italian Renaissance in textbooks is that this is the recovery of the art and the art and statuary of the ancient Greeks. But of course, what I'm trying to say, it was much more than that. So much more, in fact, that at the end of the 1400s, a writer talked about the wise and valorous men of Florence. And he was speaking not of the artists and not of the painters and sculptors and architects. He was specifically referring to the Florentine humanists who were, as I say, finding old manuscripts, translating Greek philosophy, writing, perfecting Latin prose, and doing things such as measuring the ocean, getting involved in the latest scientific discoveries. Now, one of the questions then that we would have, there's still the why. Why Florence? Why was it happening here? And in order to give a kind of explanation for it, I'd like to go back a century into the 1300s, or what Barbara Tuchman, in A Distant Mirror, a book that some of you might recall, published probably about 40 years ago now, but still a great read, what she calls the calamitous 14th century. That's the subtitle for her book. The 14th century was a grim time to be living. Francesco Petrarch said it was the worst time to be alive on earth. Petrarch was a bit of a moaner and a pessimist as far as things like that went. But on the other hand, he did have a point, because over the course of the 1300s, all sorts of disasters struck Europe, disasters that lasted decades, or in the case of the 100 Years' War, more than a century. This war between England and France that convulsed Europe for many decades. Periodically, these battles these encounters, violent encounters that would take place that were in some ways stopped only when there were outbreaks of the plague. Because, of course, as we know only too well these days, in 1348, actually 1347, until 1349, we had the Black Death, which killed perhaps 50 million people across Europe, and in Florence killed 40 to 50% of the population. And in Siena, probably an even greater amount. And it wasn't just those couple of years that the Black Death came. It would return to somewhere in Italy every 10 to 12 years, like clockwork, and kill maybe 5, 10, 15% of the population, with the result that Florence was depopulated drastically from the time of Dante and Giotto, the early 1300s, when Florence had a population of as much perhaps as 120,000, certainly more than 100,000. So it was one of the largest cities in Europe at that time, much larger than Rome. If we go forward a century from that, after the ravages of the Black Death and other difficulties, Florence in 1427, so just at the point where Brunelleschi is building the dome, Masaccio is painting his frescoes, the population had dipped to 37,000, which is the lowest that has been recorded. So from a high of 120,000 to a low of 37,000. So it took a drastic toll. Historians and art historians still debate what the effect was of that depopulation on A, the economy, and B, on the art. And those two things, I think, are almost certainly inextricably linked. I don't have time to go into that at the moment, but it's a very interesting question in art history. One of the problems confronting all of the challenges is that the church was really a failed institution for much of the previous century. There was what was called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy for the better part of 6, 7 decades through the 1300s, when the Pope Benedict VIII had been challenged by both the powerful Colonna family in Rome, and more to the point by the French. And subsequent popes then went under the protection of the French kings, and situated themselves in Avignon. So Rome was abandoned by the papacy until 1377, when it returned, albeit somewhat briefly, because the next pope after that upped stakes, Robert of Geneva, upped stakes and went back to Avignon, and someone else was elected in Rome. So what we get from 1378 for the next couple of decades is the schism in the church, where we have people claiming to be pope in both Rome and Avignon. In 1409, they gather in Pisa to try to settle the situation and elect a pope there. But the problem is the guys in Rome and Avignon refuse to step down. And so from 1410, when that election is made, until 1417, when things are more or less solved, we have three papal claimants. And so this sort of factionalism and fighting within the church, which of course divides the College of Cardinals, usually along national lines, the church is really not functioning. And we're without a kind of powerful superstructure, religious ecclesiastical superstructure, to offer, if nothing else, a kind of solace to the people. And so what happens is, and I apologize again for the graphic, people, if you crawled out of the wreckage of the 1300s and are living the first couple of decades of the 1400s, you begin to ask a series of questions and maybe begin to doubt the efficacy of religion. They certainly did not become irreligious and non-believers and atheists, but I think there was a feeling within the intellectual vanguard, at least, that if the Bible and the church provided advice on safeguarding the fate of the soul in the hereafter, something everyone regarded as important, it did not, or they did not offer advice on how to live in the here and now, how to function in society, how to rule better, how to educate your future leaders, how to bring up your children, how to pass good laws and conduct more judicious wars, write effective speeches, use rhetoric to its best advantage, understand history, serve the city, and even things such as how to be a good friend or how to find happiness. All of these things naturally occurred to people who'd been living through these dreadful times. And those questions were particularly acute in Florence because of its somewhat anomalous and exceptional situation as a republic. A lot of historians point out quite rightly that it was nominally a republic. In fact, it was a kind of oligarchy where it was run by a series of powerful families, like the Albizzi and before that the Peruzzi and the Strozzi and so forth. But what you get are assemblies of men, what Cicero said are assemblies of men which rule cities. And Cicero said, when you have assemblies of men, you need rhetoric. And I think what happened in the rest of Europe, so much of the rest of Europe was a princedom or a dukedom, somewhere that was ruled by a tyrant. And if you were a tyrant, you did not have a concern for citizenship or rhetoric or educating your populace. Or if you lived in an agricultural society, those questions were not germane. But in Florence, where as many as 5,000 to 6,000 people in a city of 60,000, 5,000 to 6,000 men who were members of guilds above the age of 29, who were not in arrears in their taxes, had the opportunity to vote, and if they were lucky, to serve on various councils and advisory bodies. So you do have a kind of democracy. It maybe doesn't provide a suitable democracy in our eyes, but it was really unique in many ways in Europe at that time, and in particular in Italy. And certainly the Florentines exalted this democracy, or what their pretense of democracy, and saw themselves as this isolated island of enlightened democracy within a sea of despotism and repression. And which is not to say that the Florentines weren't despotic and repressive when they took over cities like Arezzo and Pisa. Nevertheless, their propaganda spoke of the importance of patriotism, of liberty, equality before the law, something that the Florentines prided themselves on. And so they're concerned for all of these secular values, which for many centuries, if not a millennium, had disappeared from Western culture with really the fall of the Roman Empire in the West at the end of the 5th century. And so the answer to these questions that they were asking about how can we live a better life? How can we rule ourselves better? They decided was in the past, because what they decided the best society there had been was the one that they believed themselves as Florentines to be the inheritors of, the children of. And that was the ancient Romans. Dante, as early as about 1305, called Florence, which incidentally was not an important Roman city by any means, but Dante called Florence the most beautiful daughter of Rome. And so the Florentines saw themselves as continuing that tradition of Roman republicanism. And they were very keen to stress that that Florence had been founded during the Roman Republic, not during the Empire. And therefore, the Roman republicanism was, so to speak, in their blood. And one of the people who, one of the great advocates for returning to the values of the ancient Romans and exploring how they had made their society was Petrarch, who came from a Florentine family. But when he was born in 1304, his family had been exiled a couple of years earlier, around the time his father had been, around the same time as Dante. But Petrarch became a kind of European traveler, and also a traveler in the imagination, and a time traveler. And in his great epic poem, Africa, which he thought, ironically, considering its obscurity today, was going to be his hostage to posterity, he has this wonderful passage at the end when he talks about the sort of darkness that the world is inhabiting at his time. But he becomes a kind of prophet, and he foresees a better future. And he writes, "The sleep of forgetfulness will not last forever. When the darkness has been dispersed, our grandsons will walk again in the pure radiance of the past." And so Petrarch in some ways sees this as a work of not one generation, but at least two. And in some ways we can see that that prophecy comes true, because a lot of the Florentine humanists who come along in the early decades of the 1400s are, metaphorically speaking, the grandsons of Petrarch, because they take up the sort of torch that he first lit in the middle part of the 1300s and begin to run with it. And so what happens, of course, is that they begin a search for the wisdom of Cicero, Quintilian, Ptolemy, and Plato, and try to find works that they know exist but have been lost for, if not centuries, then the better part, in some cases, of 1,000 years. They learned, for example, from Aulus Gellius's Attic Nights, that there is a work that Cicero wrote on the Republic, and they're desperate to get their hands on it because it will become, they believe, a kind of playbook for them, a template for how to set up and run a republic, written by the great Republican apologist, theorist, and politician Cicero. Likewise, Quintilian, who after Cicero was the greatest of the rhetoricians. He was someone who taught the children of Domitian, the Emperor Domitian, at the end of the 1st century AD. He wrote his Institutes of Oratory, and the Florentines were desperate to get their hands on it because this great teacher of Roman oratory is someone from whom they believed they could learn. It was a treatise on the education of the young, among other things. And so they begin to look for all of these things as guidebooks for the future. And we then come across these very interesting characters, Poggio Bracciolini, who ultimately will become the Chancellor of Florence in the 1450s, the top civic official in Florence. But before that, he was a great scholar and manuscript hunter, and also a bureaucrat within the papal curia, the papal bureaucracy, a very prominent figure, and someone who brings back, he's the man who actually finds Quintilian. Quintilian's rhetoric, which is widely celebrated as an epoch-making moment in the history of thought and the history of education for the Florentines. He's the one who also, of course, discovers Lucretius, the copy of Lucretius on the nature of things. Niccolo Niccoli was the greatest manuscript collector in Europe, and he had the largest private collection of manuscripts in Europe in the first decades of the 1400s, which I would ask you how many books you would guess he had, and putting as a footnote to it that the average kindergarten or maybe it's grade school in the UK has to have, each one is mandated to have 1,200 books in it. And Niccolo Niccoli, fabulously wealthy and a great manuscript hunter, had 900. And that was the biggest collection of books in Europe at that time, which tells us about the scarcity of books and the difficulty of getting your hands on them in, let's say, the 1420s and 1430s, and which feeds into the desperation of people to get them. And of course, the man then who is going to requite this desire for knowledge and books and a way of making a better world is the bookseller of Florence, Vespasiano da Bisticci. And if I could see, you're all quite dark out there. If I could see, I would ask for a show of hands of how many have heard of him. He's someone who pops up in books about 15th century Florence largely as a kind of epithet, or his epithet is Cosimo de' Medici's favorite bookseller, which was very interesting to me. I thought, what does it mean to be a bookseller in Florence in the 1400s? What's his relation with Cosimo de' Medici? What books is Cosimo buying? And so forth. And as I began the research as a way into this story of the intellectual Enlightenment that begins in Florence in the 1400s, I discovered that he wasn't just Cosimo de' Medici's favorite bookseller, he was everyone's favorite bookseller. He was the bookseller to the crowned and laureled heads all over, not just Italy, but also Europe. And in fact, one quote called him the king of the world's booksellers. And he was sort of I'm hesitant to mention this because we have a couple of booksellers in the room, but he was the Amazon.com of the first half of the 1400s. He was the one who could get you whatever book that you wanted to get your hands on and produce it, as we'll see, in a very beautiful form. And so he was the one I realized I could use to tell this wonderful story. And you notice his life dates, 1422 to 98. So he covers what he himself called the golden age of Florence. He said at the end of his life, especially looking back at the first years under Cosimo de' Medici, who died in 1464, he saw that as Florence's golden age, a time when knowledge was really prized, and the world, so he thought, was going to become a better place because of it. Just to introduce him, he was born in 1422 as Brunelleschi was beginning his work on the dome. So he grew up, we can imagine, watching that happen. But he also grew up in poverty because his father had been a wool merchant who had been making a career for himself, but he died in 1426 when Vespasiano was 4 years old, and he left behind 5 children and a 6th on the way. And his travels through Florence, or his childhood in Florence, can be tracked through his mother moving to increasingly poor lodging houses and things like that, and the bailiffs coming and ultimately claiming the family patrimony, which is outside of Florence in the hills at Antella, a little bit to the southeast of Florence. And so what happens with Vespasiano, we don't know too much about his childhood. He must have received a very good education, but very quickly was talent spotted. It's unclear who exactly recognized what clearly was a kind of genius. He's one of these people, one of these precocious people that Florence seemed to produce. But of course, everywhere in Europe was producing precocious people, but they didn't have the environment to become Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo or Vespasiano da Bisticci. Florence was a very rich humus for this kind of genius that was very much nurtured and allowed to sprout and grow. And Vespasiano was a great example of that. So it might have been a schoolmaster he had who recognized how bright he was. It might have been his mother who pushed him into something, or it might have been a bookseller who saw this poor kid hanging out, looking at his books in the window under the awning. Because where Vespasiano ultimately goes to work at the age of 11 in 1433 is what was known as the Street of Booksellers, the Via dei Librai, which is marked, you'll all have walked down it, especially if when you've gone to the Bargello or something like that. It's this short stretch, now the Via del Proconsolo. And if you look up as you enter the Bargello, if you look up to the left of that, at the top of the door, the sign is still there saying Già Via dei Librai, indicating that that was once its name. And in the 1430s, there were 8 booksellers in that short stretch. And very soon afterwards, by the 1460s and 70s, I think perhaps attracted by Vespasiano and his very successful bookshop, there were 12, sometimes 13, sometimes 14 bookshops. So it becomes the place in Florence where you get this almost a university of learning occurring there. And the shop, this is exactly where it was. You can't buy books there these days. You can buy a pizza or a calzone or things like that. It's now a pizzeria, but the building still exists. The one next door I was desperately hoping was going to be, which is now a woman's fashion store, I was desperately hoping was going to be it. The 1920 guidebook to Florence claimed that it was because it has a beautiful Pietra Serena. It is this one right here, a beautiful Pietra Serena door with an open book on carved at the top and beautiful garlands coming down. There's nothing in the records of Vespasiano that give an indication that he had anything like that. So I was slightly suspicious. And a friend of mine, alas, tracked down for me exactly where his shop was. And it was this one next door. This one was Giunti, the publisher, or sorry, Giunta, the publisher, which developed in the 1500s. So it comes after him. But Vespasiano goes to work in the bookshop of a guy named Michele Guarducci, who advertised himself as a cartellaio e legatore. So bookbinding was one of the main things that he did. But he also sold books, paper, parchment, things such as that. But what happened is that this corner, and also in front of what's now the Bargello, which of course had a different identity in those days, that became known as the Canto El Palazzo, where people would stand outside the Bargello and have a kind of al fresco conversation. The bar for conversation was extremely high, and you could learn Latin apparently by standing there and listening to the disquisitions going on by the intellectual luminaries in Florence, people like Niccolo Niccoli and Poggio Bracciolini, for example, who were habitués of this street and ultimately of Vespasiano's, the bookshop of Guarducci, which of course Vespasiano, by the 1440s, becomes the driving force behind, and by the 1450s, he's a partner in it. And so what is a cartellaio? You could go in there and get books, of course. You could buy new books, ones that had just been produced, but you could get old books, books that might have been copied decades or centuries previously. You could come in with a sheaf of pages and have them bound. You could have them decorated if you want, because there was a decorator who specifically worked in that shop. You could buy supplies such as paper, which had come to Italy in the 1270s, and Prato in Florence became, or outside of Florence, became the main supplier for paper in Tuscany. It began in Fabriano. Fabriano in 1276 had the first paper mill. And booksellers really functioned as publishers, because if you wrote some poems, or you wrote a philosophical treatise, or you wrote a commentary on Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars or something like that, you could come in and get it copied out by a scribe and in triplicate, duplicate, triplicate, however many copies you wanted, and then make a gift of it to friends, or try to call attention to yourself through it. But maybe even more to the point, it became a kind of intellectual nexus, a kind of reading room where you could come in and look at books, look at some of the latest books that had maybe come up from Rome by distinguished writers. But it was also a debating society. And there were various descriptions of intellectual luminaries who would come to town, and there would be informal debates. So in many ways, it was like a British institute before the time. So you would have this intellectual exchange occurring there. And there are stories, for example, of San Bernardino of Siena coming to town and debating the great Hebrew scholar Genozzo Manetti, who incidentally was a kind of mentor for Vespasiano. And then there was the exchange of gossip and information. And I don't have time to go into this, but I do recommend chapter 15 of the book, or whatever it is, where I describe Vespasiano effectively became a spy because he knew everyone. He knew everyone in Europe. He was in close correspondence with 3 generations of the kings of Naples. And so he knew everything that was going on in Europe, and seems to have been a point of information, not just for factions within Florence itself, the Medici and versus the Pazzi, for example. And the awkward thing for him is that he was good friends with both sides in that dispute, and they were clients of his. They both commissioned books from him, but he had information, of course, that he could exchange, and something that may well have got him into trouble. So I'll just leave that hanging in suspense for you. But we have this wonderful description of how scholars of rhetoric gathered together in the bookshop of our Vespasiano, surrounded by a throng of young men, admirably disputing great things. But just to look at the what was happening in the bookshop itself, it was a kind of unique combination, you might say, of an old-fashioned sweat and dust workshop with intellectual enlightenment. Both of those things were happening there because, of course, one of the first things Vespasiano probably did as an 11, 12-year-old was go to the parchment makers, which were just down the street in what's now Via Ghibellina, and he would get parchment that had been scraped and bring it back to the shop where it would be ruled for the scribes to work on. And because, of course, if for us today, all knowledge depends on the Wi-Fi signal and the power supply. In those days, it depended on good animal husbandry and carnivorous appetites, because for the most part, paper was used, yes, but for the most part, at this time when Vespasiano was starting his career, most of the works that he's producing, and that Guarducci is producing, and that the other booksellers are creating, are done on parchment, on animal skins. And this is what they look like. This is one of the first books that, for one of the first clients that Vespasiano worked for, a man named William Gray, a high-ranking ecclesiastic who was related to the King of England. And he had studied in Germany, but had heard about these new intellectual stirrings in Florence. And so he hot-footed it to Florence and sought out Vespasiano, who created a library of books for him, which is now in Balliol College in Oxford. And so this is part of his complete works of Cicero, or all of the works of Cicero that were known at that time. Vespasiano was fluent, relatively fluent, it seems, in Latin, possibly had some Greek. I don't think he knew English, because all of his correspondence with William Gray calls him Guglielmo Grimes. So he sort of Italianized him. In any case, this is this kind of beautiful work that was produced by Vespasiano's scribes. His scribes, he had 40 or 50 of them working for him by the 1450s and 60s. Do not think of monks, although he did have a hermit who lived in the hills of Fiesole who worked for him. Vespasiano would take him a text, and this hermit would copy it out for him. But for the most part, they were notaries, or in some ways, some priests who were a bit, maybe their parish was too small to support them, and they moonlighted or had a side hustle as a scribe. And so Vespasiano had this whole troupe of people he could call on. And one of his most reliable, and I think one of the most beautiful scribes he had, was Gherardo del Ciriaggio, who produced most of this work for Gray. And when you look at it, that was going to be a zoom effect I was going to have on Keynote. So what happens, and we can thank Vespasiano and the Florentines for this, that they, among other things, reinvented the page, and they reinvented what we would now call type or handwriting, because they were so obsessed with the antique world that they wanted what Poggio Bracciolini called letters that recall antiquity. And so they really invented, this predates Vespasiano, it develops round about 1400 in Florence, this beautiful style of writing, which I think we can read quite well today. because you don't have to know Latin to figure out what the words are. And once you learn that the S's look like F's, you can make out what's being said here and read it quite well. And it's much easier to read for our eyes at least, but also crucially for the eyes of scholars in the 1400s than what preceded it, which of course was Gothic script. When it was invented, it was called modern letters because they, in the same way that Gothic architecture was called opus modernum, modern work, because the inventors of these two styles in northern France believed they were doing, quite rightly believed they were doing something new and unusual and different, different from Romanesque style or Carolingian style, different from what the ancient Romans had been doing. And so they created what was something very beautiful to look at, but something that, as Petrarch said, looked like it had been created for something other than reading, because he complained about and you did have to sound your way through it. I mean, there are, very strange anomalies to it. If we blow it up, we can see that, if you look at this word, we have ad dominum right here, AD, and you can see how the D and the O are fused together to save space and ink. And then MINUM from dominum is 11 identical strokes of the pen. And even the Gothic scribes would make fun of this. And there's a very famous poem that was written, which is about 40 similar strokes of the pen. And if you look at a word like in nostrum, the O takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 strokes of the pen. And so this is something that's time consuming to copy out, and it is also time consuming to read. And so there were various appeals in the course of the second half of the 1300s, most of all in Florence, but also from Petrarch, who really leads the charge, saying that we need a new form of writing. And Petrarch did experiment somewhat with with trying to create a new style of writing, but it finally appears in someone who we should all thank for saving us headaches and migraine headaches and neck strain, eye strain, etc. But he's disappeared to history. He's known only as the scribe of 1398, because that's when this new style eventually develops, and it's perfected by Poggio Bracciolini, who begins teaching it to scribes to copy out manuscripts. And all of Vespasiano's scribes are then trained in and use that particular style of script. Just a very quick footnote or an aside that our paragraph indentation comes about accidentally, because when you bought a book, when you bought a manuscript, it wouldn't necessarily be illustrated with foliated capitals, for example, or any kind of decoration down the border. That was often left blank, and the client could stipulate if he or she, in many cases, wanted to have it decorated. And if you didn't have enough money, all of this just remained blank, and the capital letter was missing. And when printers came along in the 1450s and 60s and began printing these works that they had in manuscript, they saw these blank spaces and left it as an indentation. And so the paragraph indentation comes about through this sort of accident of someone not having enough money to afford an illustrator to come in and do the capital for him. Just a quick point about the scribe of 1398 and Poggio Bracciolini. These antique letters seem to have been regarded by Poggio. What they were imitating, what they liked to read, was they leapfrogged back over the Gothic manuscripts of the 11 and 1200s, 11, 12, 1300s, to a different style of manuscript, which they began discovering in the libraries of Northern Europe. It seems to be the case that they thought these were actually ancient Roman works copied maybe in the 1st, 2nd century AD. In fact, of course, they came much later. They were in Carolingian script because Charlemagne wanted to have a standardized handwriting as well as a standardized Latin in order to administer his empire. And it was really Alcuin of York, an Englishman who turned up in the Frankish Empire and really became the sort of intellectual advisor to Charlemagne, who was responsible for indoctrinating or inculcating the style of writing in the scribes. And so when Poggio Bracciolini or Niccolò Niccoli found these works that were certainly ancient, they were probably at this point 400 or 500 years old, but they thought they were much older than that. And so their style of writing was a kind of attempt to replicate that. And they called them, the phrase that we get again and again is Lectura Antica Nuova, new antique letters. And in some ways, that's what the Italian Renaissance was about. It was taking the antique and making it new, giving a modern spin on it. And so if we see that in the architecture of Brunelleschi and Leon Battista Alberti, and we see it perhaps in the sculpture of Michelangelo and Donatello, we also find it in the manuscripts which are being reproduced or being created at the same time. And so this is, as I say, the style that Vespasiano's scribes are writing in. I'll just give you a quick, just to make you appreciate the efforts of the poor scribes. This is the recipe for ink. You would have crushed galls, which is the sort of excrescence that grows on an oak tree when a wasp burrows into it. And you would have white wine, pomegranate rinds, bark from a mountain ash, root from a walnut tree, gum arabic as a kind of adhesive, and then rusty nails for iron gall ink to provide the iron for it. And of course, there was also decoration. You'll have noticed in that beautiful manuscript that was done for William Gray that Vespasiano had it decorated. And he had a lot of miniaturists who worked for him and produced these beautiful, not only antique capital or these foliated capitals with what is called by bibliographers and codicologists white vine stem decoration, but also, of course, illustrations within it as well. Biblical scenes, scenes of ancient authors, etc. And this is where one of the major expenses, of course, if you want to get a manuscript, the gold leaf actually wasn't the most expensive part of it, because you could take a florin and beat it down. One of the Battalori, one of the gold beaters, could take his 15-pound hammer, put the florin between sheets of ox intestine and hammer at it day after day after day, and cover, probably you'd be able to take one florin and cover most of the floor of this room. You'd beat it down to 1/300th of an inch. So we often, when we see something with gold leaf on it, whether it's a painting or a manuscript, we think that that is the great expense of it. Whereas in fact, it's other things on the page that cost much more. And the beautiful blue that we see in so many of these, and that of course you see in many paintings, on the cloak of the Virgin Mary, for example, in many altarpieces, that is usually ultramarine blue, which is lapis lazuli, which comes from, as the name suggests, beyond the sea, which in that case, the only known source was the Hindu Kush mountains of northeast Afghanistan. So it really came from a very distant place. And it was a very involved procedure, not just to get it, to source it, but also to create the pigment from it by crushing it and soaking it, etc. And then almost equally expensive was, I'm not sure how well you can see the little flecks of yellow, that is saffron. And so the saffron comes from crocuses, which were the best source came from Persia, and to get the best crocuses came from Persia until a very clever monk put some crocus seeds into, or crocus bulbs or seeds? Bulbs. So he put bulbs into a hollowed out cane and smuggled them back to East Anglia, where they began growing in what is now Saffron Walden. And so, which is named after saffron. And it would take 3,000 crocuses to make a single ounce of saffron pigment. And so these are things that make it, of course, very expensive. Other pigments come from exotic insects, for example, such as this bug, which would be dried and then crushed, and also sap from this particular tree, which could be sourced in what are the Balearic Islands, among other places. It was known as dragon's blood, so you get these rich reds from sources like that. And so, as you might imagine, Vespasiano was producing works for the most part, for the 1%. He did carry used books, and you could go into his bookshop and get a book maybe just for a florin or two. But you could also then get books that were very expensive. His most expensive book was 70 florins, which is the equivalent of 70 ducats. A florin had 3.5 ounces of gold in it, and so 70 florins was, I calculated, the profit that Vespasiano could make for the most part each year. He did not, sadly, and I think maybe all booksellers and writers might appreciate this and sigh heavily in sympathy. Vespasiano did not become rich, despite producing these beautiful items for very wealthy people. Some of them, such as this French cardinal, Jean Geoffroy, who was one of his best clients, was very slow at paying his bills, and Vespasiano had to humiliate himself by writing to him. But 70 florins, for example, was what you could get. A good laborer on a building site might be able to get 50 to 70 florins in a good year. So 70 florins cost a lot of money. And obviously those books were not just out of the hands of the bricklayer, but out of the hands of Vespasiano himself, who felt on his own skin the Marxist theory of the alienation of labor. He would create these things that he was not able to purchase. But he, as one writer said, in the 1460s, popes, kings, princes, men learned in 3 languages, i.e. Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, all direct their steps to his door. And so he produced books for 3 members or 3 generations of the Medici family, not just Cosimo, who was a very good friend of his, but Cosimo's sons, Piero and Giovanni, who were even greater collectors of books and would have been, created even more magnificent collections had they not both died prematurely. And the Lorenziana Library in San Lorenzo has a lot of those books, a lot of those extremely beautiful books created, for example, for Piero. And then he also worked for Lorenzo the Magnificent towards the end of his career. He was very good friends with Pope Nicholas V, whose epithet is the first Renaissance Pope. In fact, Vespasiano would often host him. Vespasiano would arrange, when he was the humble Tommaso Parentuccelli, Vespasiano would arrange for Cosimo de' Medici to advance him money so he could make his way to Rome to study and things such as that. He also worked for 3 generations of the kings of Naples. They were rather gruesome characters, but like many people around Italy at that time, many people around Europe, what was happening by the middle part of the 1400s is these maybe somewhat tyrannical savage figures were trying to burnish their reputations and maybe offset these reputations for savagery by creating beautiful libraries and as well as commissioning beautiful works of art. He worked for Borso d'Este, who was quite a vulgar character who paid his frescoes by the square foot. So he saw them very much like a draper or something like that. But he created a magnificent library specifically so that he could, keep up with the Joneses elsewhere in Italy. And one of the great collections that Vespasiano put together was for Alessandro Sforza from the great Milanese family, or the great family that he was the brother of Francesco Sforza, the first Sforza, Duke of Milan. Vespasiano created a magnificent library for him, which alas burned several, and all the books were lost several decades later. He had many English clients, Richard Holes, as well as William Gray, and also probably one of his best, the man known as the Butcher of England, really the Butcher of Ireland. He was the one who behaved with great brutality towards the Irish enemies, or what he saw as his Irish enemies, and was beheaded. But when the axe fell, when the axe fell 3 times, because he was so pious that he asked the executioner to take his head off in 3 strokes, which is, usually you think 1 stroke would be the best option, but he was so obsessed with the number 3 in the Trinity that he asked for 3 whacks of the axe. But when that happened, someone said more knowledge was lost at that moment than in all the heads that existed in England. And Tiptoft was one of these guys who bought Vespasiano's books. One of his best clients, and one who was not a savage character, was very admirable in a lot of ways, is this guy, whose hand graces the American edition of the Bookseller of Florence, and that's Cardinal Bessarion, the great Greek scholar who comes to Florence in 1439 for the Council of Florence and goes over to the enemy, goes over to the Latin Church, and almost became Pope. And in fact, would have become Pope had he shaved off his beard. But the thought of a Pope with a beard in the 1450s was simply too much to countenance for the French cardinals who went after him. The greatest collection of works that Vespasiano created was for someone who was very typical of these characters I've been describing, who combine cultural sophistication with absolute brutality, was Federico da Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino, for whom Vespasiano created what Vespasiano said with no undue modesty. It was the finest library since antiquity. It was around 1,000 volumes. And we see Federico reading a copy of one of the books that Vespasiano has created for him, because Vespasiano told us that he covered all of them in red velvet and had them embossed and jeweled and things such as that. And so Federico is showing us here in this great portrait in Urbino his three roles as a father. This is young Guidobaldo. He's a soldier. He's the greatest soldier of the age. He's the great mercenary, the soldier of fortune. You have to get on your side if you go to war with someone, or at least you have to pay him not to go to the other side and fight against you. And he became fabulously wealthy as a result. And one of the consequences of that was the beautiful ducal palace in Urbino, which he stocked with this. You can go into this library that he had, Greek, one room for Greek books, one room for Latin books. You can go into it today. And he was a great reader. This isn't just for show. He would have loved Audible and audiobooks and things like that, because he had 5 people at his court whose sole duty was to read aloud to him in his moments of leisure. And he would have works such as Livy's History of Rome taken to him when he went into battle. So the night before a battle, he would be in his tent having inspirational words, or having stories of Hannibal marching across the Alps, or the feat of Scipio Africanus read to him by one of these readers. And for him, Vespasiano created what probably was his masterpiece, which is the Urbino Bible, which is now in the Vatican. The scribe, interestingly enough, was someone who came from, well, I guess what's Flanders, what today we would call Holland or Belgium, who by this time, the style of handwriting was spreading across Europe, which is then going to spread into the printing press, because if you're printing books in the 1460s, 70s, 80s, you have to make your printed book look as much as possible like a manuscript by Vespasiano, for example. And so he created this 2-volume Bible in the late 1470s. And the date might strike you, because you might be asking yourself, hold on, when was Johannes Gutenberg? Was he after that? And in fact, no, he was 20 years before that, more than 20 years before that. The Gutenberg Bible, the first eyewitness account we have of it, a very good eyewitness, a man who becomes Pope Pius II, sees it at the Frankfurt Book Fair in October of 1454. And so it's interesting and revealing that despite the fact that the printing press had been around for really a generation or two at this point, Vespasiano was still producing manuscripts with as much prolificity, if there is such a word, as ever. And the great patrons like Lorenzo the Magnificent and Federico da Montefeltro wanted handwritten manuscripts, especially from Vespasiano, because he could give not just the beautiful book, but he could give the one that was the most accurate and the most scholarly. And so the printing press had not overtaken manuscript writing and illustration at this point. And we sometimes think of, or well, not me and not you, I'm sure, but some people think of manuscript illustration as a minor art. But in fact, it was not. And just look at the people who were involved in the creation of the Urbino Bible. And we have Domenico Ghirlandaio, who 2 years after this is going to be called by the Pope or sent by Lorenzo the Magnificent to Rome to work on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. And he's there with his workshop, his brothers, Davide and Benedetto, and also probably the greatest manuscript illustrator of the day was Francesco del Chierico, who worked on all of the great manuscripts of that time in Florence. You might also have been struck by the date when it was finished, 1478, which is the date of the Pazzi conspiracy against the Medici, where Sixtus IV attempts to effect a regime change in Florence, get rid of the Medici, get rid of Cosimo and his brother, Giuliano, and put in power someone who's going to be more sympathetic to his political interests to the east of Tuscany, and not threaten him and his project, Sixtus's project, of establishing a kind of dynasty for the Della Rovere family at that point. Lorenzo, as you probably know or can guess, survived the assassination attempt, which took place in the Cathedral of Florence. The signal was the priest, signal to strike was the priest raising the host, and some of the assassins were priests who attacked and killed Giuliano. So the younger brother of Lorenzo was killed. And of course, what then followed for the next 2 years were what are called the Pazzi Wars, where Sixtus IV and Federico de Montefeltro, as his military muscle, tried to defeat Florence in combination with, on the side of Sixtus, for example, the King of Naples, King Ferdinand of Naples. And so Florence is at war at this point. And Federico, as the captain of the papal armies at this point, as the hired gun of the Pope, begins to fret that he is not going to get his Bible, which Vespasiano has been working on for 2 years. And so he goes to his agent in Florence, Vespasiano da Bisticci, and beseeches him to have a word with Lorenzo to let the Bible leave. And there's a kind of ceasefire almost in which the Urbino Bible leaves Florence and goes to Urbino, and at which point fighting begins again. Federico writes to Lorenzo, and incidentally, Lorenzo knew that Federico was behind the plot and was camped outside the gates of Florence, ready to attack, ready to kill him if necessary, but wrote him this very polite letter thanking him, saying, Vespasiano promptly and with goodwill offered every help and favor in sending the Bible which I had made in Florence, for which I thank your magnificence. At which point the guns then started firing again, and the war continued until 1480. But just these are some pages and illustrations from the Urbino Bible. And last point I'll make about Vespasiano is that he never embraced the printing press. He was highly suspicious of it. And he said of Federico de Montefeltro's library that all 900, 1,000 books in it were handwritten, most of them by Vespasiano's scribe. Scholars have gleefully seized upon a couple of printed books that were in the library. Vespasiano says in this quote, a printed volume would have been ashamed to be among them. They wouldn't want to show their face among his beautiful manuscripts, which, of course, there were beautiful books being printed at that time too, but Vespasiano's objection wasn't so much against the aesthetics of the printed book, it was against what he regarded as a kind of slipshod production in which the printers did not have good editorial control, or didn't have editors, whereas Vespasiano would look at all of the manuscripts he could find, assess the variant readings, and then produce the best copy of it. And there's a very revealing statement from as early as 1444, when Vespasiano was only 22 years old, where a bishop in Arezzo is looking for a copy of Pliny's Natural History, of which there were some 300 manuscripts across Europe. and he says, we want the best one. We want to copy the best one. And he says, our Vespasiano in Florence is the best guide for such things. So suddenly at the age of 22, Vespasiano had become the recognized expert in what the field that we today call codicology. He was the one who could trace, who could look at the variant readings, because of course, if you had two copies of Pliny's Natural History, each one was going to have hundreds of variant readings, because as the scribes made mistakes, honest mistakes in the copying. And so what Vespasiano would do would be to look at those variant readings and decide which was best, or know of a third copy that had another reading which was the correct one. And so Vespasiano had a fear, like perhaps we have of the internet, that bad things are going out there, misinformation, errors are being replicated, not just by maybe the dozen in the case of manuscripts, but in the case of printed books, by the hundreds and ultimately the thousands. So he never accepted the printing press, which of course had arrived by the middle of the century. And it was really driven by this demand for books, which Vespasiano had been writing for decades. Because between the 1420s and 50s, so really the first decades of Vespasiano's career, manuscript production in Western Europe increased 40% every decade. So this really was a growth industry. The price of books was coming down, partly because paper was being used more than parchment, and also literacy rates were beginning to rise, not just in Florence, but elsewhere. And so someone on the banks of the Mains decides that there has to be a better way of producing books, and that this format that for 1,000 years had served Europeans. And he decided that there was a different way of doing things. And so in 1454, he debuted his Bible. But there are stories that when he appeared with it in Frankfurt in 1454, he tried to convince people that it was a handwritten manuscript. And the best encomium you could get as a bookseller or as a printer in the 1460s, 70s, and 80s is that this looks like a handwritten manuscript, because you had to replicate the sort of things that people were familiar with. And just to reiterate, especially the guy who produced more manuscripts than anyone else, and that was Vespasiano. But ultimately, of course, even if you're Vespasiano, you cannot, and you have all of the resources and knowledge that he had, you can't fight a change in technology, that sort of ineluctable change. And so he retired in 1480, he gave up the lease on his shop, and went to what he called his sweet and lovely place at Antella, outside of Florence. The house still exists, and it's been dramatically fixed up in the last 5 or 6 years. I had a more rustic image of it, but someone has invested a huge amount in it, including these what look like windows that are going to keep out the wind and cold. He retired there, and there's a sadness to this, because he had this project for humanism that he was going to try to make the world a better place. But in fact, he was quite disillusioned by the end of his life by things such as the Pazzi conspiracy. And he retired 2 years after that. He called his lawyer, who had an office just 2-3 buildings away, a guy named Ser Piero da Vinci, and had him draw up the legal documents to hand over the lease. Leonardo da Vinci's father, of course. The only good thing about that is he wrote he devoted the rest of his life, which he lived 18 more years. He died the same year as Savonarola. He lived those 18 more years, and during those 18 years, he wrote his memoirs, what you can get in print as the Vespasiano Memoirs, in which he gives an account of biographies of 103 people that he knew and that he dealt with, everyone from Cosimo de' Medici and King Ferdinand of Naples to people like Poggio Bracciolini, Niccolo Niccoli. And so this is a work that really gives us not just the intellectual history of Florence and Italy at that point, but gives us glimpses into the personal lives of so many of the people who made history, intellectual as well as political and religious history, for the course of the 1400s. So I much recommend that book to you, but even more, I recommend the Bookseller of Florence to you. So I'll end on that note. And I think I may have gone too long, but my excuse is I can't see the clock in the darkness. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Wow. What a tour de force. Microphone. Hello? Oh, yes, there we go. What a tour de force, Ross. Yeah, you did run over, but it didn't matter because it was fascinating. And no notes. So, knows his stuff. And I do strongly recommend the book, which is on sale there, along with some of the other titles for which Ross is known. Because, yeah, you got the gist of it, but there's a lot more in the book. So go for that. So Q&A time, as always. We've got lots and lots of people on Zoom. And Zoom people, if you want to join us, you can put something in the comments or you can unmute and talk to us, and we'd love to hear from you. In a moment, I'll open it up to the floor. And the discipline is you put your hand up, and I bring you the microphone, because then the Zoom people can hear your question. Whilst you're thinking about it, there's a couple of things in the chat already. Were women allowed to go to the booksellers' shops? Also, were women writers? Yes, there were. Represented the collection of the books. And yeah, thank you. Can you say more about the manuscript hunters? What and how were they hunting? And lots of people saying, excellent, fabulous, thank you. So there's a couple of things to get started on, whilst we look for questions in the room as well.
Yes, there were learned women in the 1400s, maybe foremost among them, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, the wife of Lorenzo the Magnificent. I'm sorry, the mother of Lorenzo the Magnificent. I could not find evidence that she ever went into his shop and purchased books from him. One of the things I would have to say about Vespasiano is he was not an enlightened person in terms of his idea of gender relations, because I said he became a writer at the end of his life. And one of the things that he wrote was advice for young women who were going to get married. And he presented a copy of this to a very good friend of his, someone from the Pandolfini family. And I think if any of us were to give it to a young woman on the brink of marriage, or anyone on the brink of marriage, we might get it thrown back in our face. The key virtue for a woman was prudence and chastity and obedience and things such as that. So he was very much unreconstructed. And I could not find examples of women who actually went into the shop, but Florence was not necessarily a paradise for women at that time, because when in 1478, during the Pazzi conspiracy, the cathedral in Florence was split in half with a cloth. And I found a record of a new cloth being created for the 1460s. I think it was the date at which I saw it, and the cloth separated men from women. And of course, you probably know the churches in which they have the women's gallery at the top. So there was this physical segregation of men and women. And so Vespasiano wrote one. So the Vespasiano memoirs are 103 illustrious men from the 1400s and one woman. And so you think, great, he's writing about a woman. What does he have to say? And it's a woman from the Bardi family. But once again, what he writes about her is that she was virtuous, and he invokes He invokes, for example, the wonderful example of Portia, the wife of Brutus, who he thinks was the perfect wife because of the fact when Brutus was killed, she swallowed hot coals and committed suicide. And of course, he gives examples of various saints who had died to preserve chastity and things such as that. So however much we might want to extol Vespasiano for his dissemination of knowledge and his humanist project, trying to make the world a better place, I think, alas, it's safe to say the plight of women was not all that much on his mind, but rather it was on his mind. He was very apprehensive of what might have happened if women did not behave with the kind of prudence and chastity that he encouraged and wanted to inculcate in them.
You have a question here from Troy.
Thank you. Great presentation. You mentioned the word humanism a couple of times.
Yes.
Can you explain that to a layperson such as myself?
Sure. It's a very confusing term, and I should have, thank you for the question, I should have explained that because of the fact that today it has a very different meaning than what it had then. They took the idea of what we would call the humanities, humanitatis, from Cicero, and this really comes from Cicero's writings on the trivium and quadrivium, which are the liberal arts and what it is to be human. And so these are the arts of the freeborn man, and I think I can probably, in Cicero's case, and also in the case of a lot of the 15th century humanists, use that gendered term, what it is to be a free man, a freeborn person. And so these are the arts such as grammar, music, rhetoric, things like that you exercise to become fully human, by which they meant, for the most part, to become a civic person, to become someone who was involved in political society and able to take your place. You could say that the humanities in universities today do still have, in fact, I would argue that they should have that should be one of their aims, that what you're doing is not just creating a kind of vocational path for someone, that what you're doing is trying to give them what the Florentine humanists wanted, which was a kind of understanding of the society in which we live, and human personality, human behavior, political society, what it means to live in a community. And so it really was, the human in humanism really is what we are in our essence as humans and how we relate to one another.
Thank you. Before we take the next question, I'm going to ask Sarah to put up the comment, the link for those on the Zoom who want to make a donation. We're always pleased to have you with us, and you're not charged up front. Everyone in the room pays their dues, and so those on the Zoom, if you feel like making a contribution of whatever size is comfortable, please use the Just Giving link that Sarah will post now. Commercial over. More questions in the room. Any thoughts? Yeah, we've got one at the back there.
Thank you again for the presentation. You spoke a bit about the Dark Ages in the book and how they weren't really as dark. There were writings and manuscripts being produced in other parts of the world. Maybe talk about some of that and where some of the other concentrations of manuscript writing was taking place and why.
Sure, and in some ways that goes into a question or dovetails with the question someone had on Zoom about where the manuscript hunters found their works. Yes, I mean, what I think most medievalists would say is that Petrarch was being too hard on that period, because after all, the century before he lived, the 1200s, was the age of the universities. University of Bologna, founded perhaps as early as 1088, University of Oxford 1200, Cambridge 1209, Salamanca, Padua, etc., all coming later in that century. So we have a sort of development of knowledge. All of Aristotle, all of the Aristotle that existed had been translated by the 1250s. And so there is a great efflorescence of knowledge at that time. And I suppose what Petrarch would say is it was being put to inadequate uses. It wasn't being used for the betterment of society and the betterment of individuals. It was used perhaps to buttress arguments made by the church, for example. But where the works were being found, for example, the Quintilian or the Lucretius were in the monasteries of Northern Europe. Virtually everything that could have been found in Italy had been found, but knowledge had moved. That, if you want to talk about Dark Ages in Italy, they begin in 568. I mean, in some ways, you could date the fall of the Roman Empire not to 476, when the last emperor in the West is deposed, but because life in some ways continued on under the Ostrogoths and Theodoric, people like that, much as it had under Roman emperors. But 568, the Lombards, 200,000 Lombards come across the Alps and invade. and really destroy what had been Roman culture. They were the barbarians who stayed. And at that time, knowledge fled, and it fled to the British Isles, or it fled to Ireland and the British Isles. And the Irish and missionaries from Northumberland, then a century or two after that, migrate across the Channel and go to northern France and Germany to educate the barbarians, to Christianize them. And they're the ones who then, under Charlemagne, so we're in the 700s and 800s now, begin copying out these manuscripts, or copying out. I mean, I'll just make a brief aside about why so much knowledge was lost. It wasn't that the Christians did not want to copy out works of the pagans, because in many cases they did. But what happened was all of the ancient Cicero, Plato, Aristotle, Quintilian, all of their works were on papyrus, which had a life perhaps of 500 years. So Cicero's work on the Republic, it was copied in, say, the last copy of it was made in the year dot, in the year 1 or 2 AD. What had to happen is in the year 500, there had to be a technological changeover from papyrus to parchment, which was the support of the Christians. The Christians wrote on parchment, the pagans wrote on papyrus. And so you needed to get someone to make that transition. And the Christian scribes did. They copied Lucretius, for example, this supposedly atheistic work. And there were various copies of it at Bobbio, for example, in northern Italy. And that's the places to which Poggio Bracciolini and manuscript hunters like that went in order to try to find. They would ransack the monasteries, or sort of blag their way into the monasteries to look at the libraries and blow the dust off these ancient works that had been copied out maybe in the year 800, and look at them and then recopy them and give them a shelf life of another couple of hundred years. So it's this transition from this technological change, as well as a change from pagan to Christian, that makes it so that these works survive into the 1400s and the time of the printing press.
It's remarkable that any of it survived.
Yes, yes.
And presumably an awful lot was lost.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Indeed. Just going to see if there's any more in the comments here. No, it's just lots of more fan things. Anyone want to talk to us? Brenda, I can see you. Do you want to talk to us? Yes, you can.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Simon. Yes, I was actually in the middle of writing something in the chat. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. And also thank you for mentioning the preservation of ancient knowledge by Irish monks. But I was just about to say, should we also include Islamic scribes as well for the preservation of a lot of these ancient manuscripts?
Yes, absolutely, because that is how Aristotle survived, because Aristotle was copied into Syriac, or a lot of them were copied into Syriac from Greek, and then from Syriac into Arabic, or sometimes directly from Greek into Arabic in Baghdad, where there was the House of Wisdom. So in this dark period in the West of the Lombard possession of Italy, simultaneous with that was the Islamic Golden Age, when you had Al-Kindi and people like that sort of micromanaging the translation of so much work from the Greek world. It's unclear what exactly, I mean, they were interested in these works inherently, but there's one theory that they were also trying to outdo the Persians and show that Islamic culture was going to be superior to Persian culture. And so they were taking not just their own work, but the best and brightest from ancient Greece and Rome. And those are the works that initially are copied in Baghdad. And then, of course, with under the caliphate in Cordoba, Aristotle comes to the West via the Iberian Peninsula.
Yes.
And ultimately that becomes Christian when Alfonso el Bravo takes Toledo from the Muslims, and that beautiful library, which has been created by Islamic scholars, falls into Christian hands. And you have people like the scribe or translator known as Herman the German, who turns up in Toledo and begins translating. William of Moorbeck as well. And so there is this sort of passing of the knowledge from the Islamic world to the Christian world. And so, yes, absolutely. The Irish scholars, Islamic scholars, people like the Venerable Bede in Northumberland, all of them play a huge role in that preservation and transmission.
Yeah. I was also
Can I
thinking
add
of, sorry to interrupt. Just briefly, I was thinking of having visited Bobbio and the very important library set up there by St. Columbanus. What was it, the seventh century? Would possibly have had these kinds of manuscripts being transcribed at that time.
Yeah,
that's
thanks,
right,
Brenda. We are, I'm afraid,
Thank you. Sorry.
out of time. So, Lisa, if you want to make your point quickly, and then we'll see if there's any last thing in the room, and then we're going to have to wrap.
Could I add to that Brunetta Latino, who is Dante's teacher, goes to the court of Alfonso el Sabio and brings back to Florence and teaches Dante Aristotle's Ethics and Ptolemy's Astronomy, which become the structuring of the Commedia back in the 12th century and 13th century. I've been studying these manuscripts in the Laurentian Library for 50 years now and have edited them and published them.
Oh, wonderful. Well, and that's a fantastic illustration of the way in which knowledge goes from one culture to another and then gets transformed into something new and different, and that one culture, one writer builds on a tradition from another culture.
Yes.
Sorry, Lisa, that was Julia who talked to us, but never mind. Good to hear from you, Julia. Okay, I think we're very near the end. If there's any last burning comment or question in the room, I think we probably need to wrap now. And we'll thank Ross.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Again, thanks a lot to Silvio Fox for being our sponsor tonight. And in a moment, we'll go through for the wine. Our season sponsors are Castiglione del Bosco. So some of the nice wines that have been served in the other room. But for those who want to buy books, now's the moment. And Ross very kindly agreed to stay here and sign. I will bring you a glass of wine, sir.
Perfect. Great. Don't forget, Christmas is just around the corner.